now it's time for our next session. It's the engineering leadership panel with Jenn, who is a senior director at Etsy, Kamilah, who is the head of financial products at Gusto, and Willie, who is a VP of engineering at Salesforce. We're going to get together and discuss all things engineering leadership. Hi. So as we have all the amazing panelists join us via Zoom, I'm going to quickly run through their backgrounds and their experience level as managers so it can set things in context. Let's start with Willie. Willie has been a manager for 9 years. Within less than a year of turning into a manager, a role that she sort of begrudgingly got into, she even started to manage a manager. So now that I've started with you, Willie, and we have everyone here, let's go into why you had to go into the role of management begrudgingly. Why did you have to be coaxed into it? And since you got into managing a manager so quickly after that, which one was the harder transition to make? Was it being a new manager or managing a manager?
I call myself a reluctant manager because the 14 years that I was a software developer, all my managers would always ask me, "Oh, why did you go into management?" And I always had this feeling that managers were, I didn't have a good opinion of them. They played and they manipulated and they weren't very transparent. That's what I felt like. And during my time, all of them were men, and I didn't see myself in it. So then I joined Salesforce as a developer, and after a while, I became Scrum Master, which I really enjoyed, and I loved working with my team. Then there was a reorganization, and our team was moved from one place to the next, and our manager stayed behind. And at that point, my peers on my team apparently said, "Hey, why didn't you ask Willie to become the manager?" And that had never happened to me. And so the guy I was going to be reporting to was a super good manager. And he said, "You know what? Why don't you try it for 1 year? And after a year, your development skills haven't atrophied. So after a year, you can always go back." And I started, and I'm still doing it. So that's been going well. For me, actually getting a manager under me was more, I will say, almost traumatic, because I hired a wonderful one, and she was super excited, and she would come to me. She's like, "Hey, why are we doing this? And why are we doing that? And we should be looking at this." And every time she said that, I was like, "Oh, I should have done that. And I'm such a failure because I didn't." And then, of course, luckily, as she was doing such a great job and I saw what that did to the team, I realized that it was perfect to actually hire her, because I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't give the team really what it needed. And so, because I had other things to work on. So that shift in thinking, that it's not just I'm a failure, she came in, that was hard. And only when she ended up hiring a manager under her did I fess up and tell her, and it helped her when she had to go through it. So, yep.
That's so interesting. I see a lot of people commenting that they can sort of, connect with that. Now, interestingly, you, Jenn, you've been a manager for over 6 years now, and you had a little bit of runway before you started to manage managers. And your belief is that your transition into management, first-time management, was a bigger jump than, your org growing and you having to manage a manager. Tell me more.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been in management about six and a half years. I managed a little bit before that in consulting, but it's the people portion of the management wasn't there. It's more about projects. And so why was my transition into management a bigger jump than managing managers? I think it's because, at the end of the day, I had never really had a good manager before. And so the very first job that I accepted was at Etsy. That was my first job into true management as I define it today. And the job was offered to me by someone named Rafe. who was the best manager I had ever had. I'd never had a manager like him before, so I'd never had that experience. And so this is a really, really big eye-opening experience for me, and a really big jump because honestly, I kind of had to redefine and rewire everything that I thought that I knew about this job. But also while doing the job, right? Because I was already hired to be a manager. And I figured out pretty quickly that I had no rubric or real understanding of what it meant to be a good manager. I had to throw everything away. I had just never seen it. And just like to paint the picture because it's fun, I wasn't young at this time. I was like well into my 30s. I had 1.5 kids. I was super pregnant. I had already gone through kind of like a big, long chunk of my career at multiple like big companies. And I had gotten used to kind of struggling through my career, looking for mentorship or this elusive thing that people called sponsorship. That's what you really need, is to find an ally and like support. And I just never was able to do it successfully. And so I felt really, really alone kind of all the time in navigating my career. And so I had to do a lot of reprogramming because it turns out like that is actually the manager's job to help you with those things and to support you, and so that was now my job, but I just didn't even know that. So just to make it like super tangible, a few things that I remember learning really early on just by watching Rafe do his job. And it was kind of like this epiphany, like, holy crap, this is the job. It's kind of cool. I realize it's my manager's job to kind of like advocate for me in places that I'm not. Like that's a huge one. And it's my manager's job to help me, navigate my career and to think about me and opportunities for me. And that is part of their job and not just like a favor or, a 2-minute piece of advice that they're going to, they have a couple minutes and they'll drop some advice as they walk past your desk. It's actually a foundational piece of their job. Right. And then outside of me, it's also your manager's job and responsibility to prioritize things for your org and your team, like fairness, inclusion, diversity, building a culture of psychological safety. Like those things don't happen for free or out of magic. It's your actual job to like build those things into your team. And that was really fascinating to me. I just never seen it before, and I never considered it as part of the manager's job. And so I think it was a really hard transition for me because I had to relearn all these things very late in my life, but it was a really good one. And I'm kind of like so thankful for having had such a great manager at that really important transition point in my life, to kind of show me what I think is the difference between being like a good leader versus just being a manager. Like, can you imagine the type of manager I might have turned out to be with this whole life of experiences that I was carrying along with me and kind of like going in this total other direction? So that was a really big change for me.
That's interesting, Jenn, because we have on the other side of the spectrum, our newest entrant into the dark side, Kamilah. You've not been a manager for a full year even. When we've known each other a long time. And when I first met you, I feel like I remember you saying you'd never move into management. You were an IC for life, like wanted to grow as a tech lead. So I'm curious, and I'm sure most people will be, what made you change your mind? We meet a lot of people at Girl Geek events that are like sort of sitting on the fence and not really knowing what their path is. So I'm sure it's going to be insightful for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. I very much had I just wanted to like grow on this like tech lead path, which I actually did. And so I think there was like part of it where I got to that goal of like, okay, I can really do this. I can be a very senior tech lead. I'm able to accomplish this, and I can be really effective at this as well. And I think that was a really rewarding experience for me. But I think sort of similar to Jenn, I'd also had just like a lot of like sort of like anti-examples of like what to do as a manager. And I think that was a huge part of my hesitance, is that I was like, I couldn't see the value in the job because I wasn't seeing a lot of like great examples of it, and it seemed like a fairly thankless role. And there were a couple of things that like happened. One was that I took this course some years ago, general management through Harrison Metal. And that actually started to shift my mind. I was like, oh, I understand what the role of management is, and in making this like a functioning organization and like really what you want to see. And I think that was like the beginning of my like, maybe like not opposed to like trying this out at some point. Like I can see where like how impactful it can be to have like the right people in this role. So I had that in the back of my mind, and then when I joined Gusto, I think similar to Jen, I had like finally like my first example of like, oh, like this is like what a good manager is, and I voiced pretty early on when I joined that this is something I was thinking of, and again, very similarly, he really like advocated for me and had me in like the right like rooms, and like when I wasn't there, like would like voice and like sponsor me. And I remember having this moment, I think the first time that happened, like, oh, is this sponsorship? Like amazing. Like I read about this for so long. Like now I see what they mean when they talk about sponsorship. And then seeing like how he would work, through with like coaching people on his team at different levels and really helping to grow engineers. And I think all of that just gave me like, okay, like this is something that I think would be really rewarding. And then the last part of it is that there's like, I think if you're really there are like a couple different archetypes of like the senior tech lead. And I'd say there's at least one of them that starts to overlap with an engineering manager, because you are like coaching a lot of engineers, right? And you're helping with that prioritization and the strategy. And so as I found myself growing into that archetype of the tech lead, I thought, let me try this out and see how this goes. So I'm still within my 1 year. I have a friend who has a bet. They believe I will stick through it past the 1 year. And I'm honestly, I am like enjoying it. It's been very rewarding so far.
That's wonderful. Glad you're, more inclined to stay, and now you're also managing a manager. So
exactly, yeah. I mean, I'll probably owe my friend $100 dinner, but that's fine.
So, Willie, you spoke about the early struggles, and I know from our conversations you've considered not really having that strong network as one of your early missteps. Tell us more about that, and what is it that people can do, and what the benefits are.
Yeah, I think for me it was very much, there were very few women around during my whole career. Not until I got to Salesforce did it become a little bit more common, and so I was not used to confiding in people or reaching out to people. Asking for help is actually a skill. I definitely then wasn't good at it. So what happened was I became a manager, had some manager under me, and then I would feel super, super heavy that everything depended on me. And I had so much responsibility, and it freaked me out from time to time. So what I would do is, this was still pre-COVID in the office. So I would get through a very difficult meeting, run to the bathroom, get a cry out, and just like, oh, then suck it up and kind of like, all right, I got this, going there. And it was, if I look back on it, there's such a waste of energy and such a lot of, it takes too much out of yourself. And so the stupid thing of me was that I did tell my ICs that they needed help and they needed somebody to commiserate with, but I hadn't figured it out for myself yet. Better. I have a very solid network of friends and peers, but also people above me and people below me. So people above you is super important, because they kind of have the experience and that viewpoint that you're striving to get to. And so one of the benefits there was, early on when I had to add more managers, I had this feeling like, so am I just going to hire the same person over and over again, in a way, the same template? And my then mentor, who was, I think, even 2 levels above me, she was just like, no, well, one of the things that have worked for me is that I hire for what I am not good at or what I don't like to do. And that was spot on, right? Because you're forming a team, and in a team, you need different abilities. For myself, I actually really enjoy mentoring. I have quite a few. From time to time, I've had to cut back because it does take time and it takes a lot of listening, but it's a way of giving back. And that's, my network is where I commiserate, where I vent, where I ask for help, where I start my first ideas and hey, what do you think? I'm thinking this, or there's this situation. Doesn't mean that they're all at the same company. keep people around, I would say, people that I trust and that have nothing to do with my current company, that can be super helpful too. So yeah, having that network is really important. Everyone in my org, I ask, do you have it? If not, can I help you get one? Like, can I matchmaker, that kind of thing? It's important.
I feel like especially remote, right? Like it's so valuable to have that like network of folks who are doing like this job or similar jobs and at other companies. Like helps you like know like you're not going crazy, or like everybody's like trying to figure this thing out right now.
Yeah, and it's anything in life almost takes a village, right? It's not just rearing kids, as they always say, but you know, it's almost anything, and that village, that can be your network, and that can be so much easier. Life doesn't have to be that hard. Not like I made it.
I wonder, can I ask, like, because I feel like that's one of the things that I struggled with is building that network. I'm just not great at it. I never really have been. And then the past 2 years have just like made it so much worse.
Yeah.
I'm not even really good at like keeping in touch with my friends, let alone going so far out of my comfort zone and like building a network from scratch. Like, what kind of tips? Like, it sounds like you have had a lot of success in being able to build and maintain that, and that's awesome. I feel super jealous. Like, what kind of tips can you give about that?
I picked up many of them through work, different jobs that I've had. Then at classes, very often at certain courses that you take, there'll be somebody and you're put together and you have to do some stupid exercise, and yet you kind of, you find and it clicks. And then I'm like, oh, okay, let me talk some more. And the ones that it clicks with, I kind of stay in touch with. Now, during COVID, just like you, I've had a really bad time. I have not added on anyone for me. I've had mentees reach out and I've taken on new mentees, but I'm really looking forward to the next kind of big gathering and talking and meeting people again, in the hopes that something happens there. But most of them are different projects I've done, classes, that kind of stuff. It's hard. Networking is super hard. It's super so uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also like, how do you break the ice? Like you said, Jenn, things have just gotten so much harder with COVID. But I feel like, just from the comments we're seeing in this conference, that there's a lot of people who are feeling very energized to go outside of their comfort zone, including me. So I feel like all of you spoke about having this like not such a great opinion about management, and like through that I sort of sensed and also directly got that you probably just didn't have the right examples of good managers. So Kamilah, now that you've been managing a manager for the last few months, what are the qualities you believe should be in a manager that's not just managing an IC, but also managing managers, more junior or more senior? What is it that, everyone can learn from?
Yeah, it's definitely been a really interesting transition to, and like in fast succession, which is, part of the life at a growing startup for sure. Something that I found interesting is that there are a fair amount of similarities to, managing or coaching a manager, and then also like coaching a more senior engineer. I think that was something that I didn't like sort of cotton on to immediately, and of course, like did my thing. I read lots of books, read lots of things as I tried to like figure out how to get into that like mindset. And there's some differences, but also like, honestly, I think a huge overlap. The other thing that's been helpful for me is to also like recognize that like everyone has their different like way that they prioritize or think of things when they're making those decisions and like leading a team, and not trying to, like, for me to be an effective manager, I have to sort of like meet people like where they are and understand like what is the right types of like guidance and like advice to give people that'll like resonate with like how they work through and how they lead on. And yeah, I found that like helpful, as I said, for managing tech leads, and also like for managing managers, like really like a large large overlap. The one other, I would say, sort of difference, and something like I'm still learning though, is that you do have to, there's definitely a, like, when it's someone immediately and I see on your team, right, you have a little bit more like insight and overview around like how the project is like executing, right? And like, like a Tizer loop, feedback loop, when like understanding like when you need to adjust like how you're like operating, and it's a little bit more of a delayed, you get it back in like layers. So I would say that's the other thing. And you see folks talking about that a lot. I think it's in some ways maybe even a little trickier with us being like remote and distributed, because it takes a little bit of a while sometimes to get that signal back.
Yeah, I mean, while we're trying to be that perfect manager, because we all know what a bad manager looks like, but it's a little bit harder to turn into that perfect manager that we wish we had. There's going to be missteps along the way. And Jenn, from our last conversation, you had a really interesting story about how you needed to adapt while your org changed. So tell us more about that.
Yeah. I'm glad you thought that story was fun. It's a learning story for me. And it's kind of about growth and change. Etsy has changed a lot and grown a lot in the past few years, not just in size, the company overall, but kind of in our commitment to like be a data-driven, machine learning first company. And I run a data engineering team. So this is like a lot of change and growth and fast-paced movement in my org. So like, just for context, I'm a person that loves context. When I first started at Etsy, I was hired to manage a small team of 2 data engineers within a smaller data end construct. And now fast forward 6 years, I run 6 teams with 60 people on them and with 8 managers and 2 directors, like in my reporting chain. And I'm not giving you this context to be braggy, but because it's very relevant to my story and the lesson that I learned. And I guess my point is like when I first started at Etsy, like we got big, but first we were small, right? And we felt really small. And I kind of like grew up with this small team of people around me with 2 to 3 managers reporting to me. And we kind of like worked side by side, making decisions together, blurred reporting lines. It was a very, very flat hierarchy. And my reports, even the ICs that report to me, like we all felt like colleagues. I always leaned really, really hard because of that into leadership by consensus, and that worked really, really well for us. And it feels good, leadership by consensus feels good. Everyone's agreeing and like kind of coming to these conclusions together. And then it felt pretty all of a sudden, without kind of like any announcement or flagship moment, or like I didn't get like a ribbon or something to like indicate that this was going to happen. Things just kind of like stopped working so well. And I started noticing that the old practices weren't working anymore. And they're actually like creating a ton of confusion and ambiguity within this org that had grown. It had kind of like grown. So like what happened? We had hired more managers, people who didn't know me, and via osmosis, like people who didn't know me, but also who didn't even report directly to me. They're like skip level reports. And by osmosis, I was kind of hearing they are confused by my engagement style. Like in our weekly managers meeting, people were confused by my questions. Is Jenn asking us to make a decision, or is she like, why is she oversharing? Is she telling us what to do? Or like all these open-ended questions. Like it was just creating a lot of confusion for people. And it was confusing for people because I was still treating them like what I thought was the management style, leadership style that had worked for such a long time. It's like, familiar old friends sitting around a living room together, troubleshooting problems for the org, and then going out and like fixing them all together. But what I learned was that my org had grown and changed, and I knew that, and that was obvious, right? Because you can see that change, but there were less obvious changes that had happened that I did not detect, right? Like more subtle, and that I had to change my leadership style in order to accommodate for that, and the leadership style that I was using, that I was leaning into, it just wasn't working anymore, and it was actually causing like a negative impact for my people. So it's not just that it stopped working, but it was creating a bad experience for people. We had kind of like outgrown this. And this was a really big change for me. And it was a change, like, I didn't like it, right? I didn't like to feel like I wasn't part of this group of people anymore. And so what worked, and what I ended up doing is I started to kind of like distance myself from this like now large group of people, these managers, who I had thought of as my peers, my collaborators, you know, and like I had to play a different role for them, and find a totally different way to lead for all of them, not just the ones I knew and the ones I didn't know, but for all of them in aggregate. Like there wasn't any like picking and choosing. And so, it was like, you know, it was a little bit lonely. I had to find kind of like back away from these people that I felt like so familiar with, and find my own peers elsewhere, you know, other directors and other orgs to seek advice from. You know, this goes to your, you know, networking. I'm not awesome at networking. And it's an interesting lesson to learn, because if I look back, it feels super obvious, right? Like I've read a million articles that say that this happens. Like it's not like an amazing epiphany. Like everyone's like, wow, I can't believe you learned that amazing thing. But it surprised me how subtle the change was. You know, like I didn't get a memo or anything, and I didn't recognize it until it was like right on top of me, kind of like kicking me in the face. So so I thought that was a really, really kind of interesting lesson to learn. That I learned like on the path.
Yeah, it's a little unfortunate sometimes, because by the time you get feedback as a manager, you know, it feels like it's coming in when a lot later than you would like, because it's almost like everyone expects you to have your crap together.
Yeah.
Already, and be perfect,
That feedback
you know?
loop, right? The
Yeah.
feedback loop is so slow. That was one of the things I noticed in transitioning, like from being an IC to management, is there's no satisfying feedback loop where you can finish something, run the test, and be like, this is good. I did a thing today. Like the feedback loop in management can be like a year, like months, maybe even multiple years. And it's very, very rewarding work, but that you got to have some patience for it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that my managers had said was that it's like you like that adrenaline that you get, you know, like when you're able to build something, you're like, yes, it compiles, or like, yes, it went through the way. Like you don't get that hit, but you do get it, but it's in a different thing. It's like you're able to get your intern an offer, or like you're able to get someone like promoted, or like the thing that, you know, someone was working towards, they did that, and you're able to see them do that. But it's just like, it's a much longer like investment. And so it takes like longer to like get that, like, oh yes. Or conversely, if like you were trying to coach someone towards something, like also takes longer to be like, oh no, this is not working. Like you got to change like tactics.
Yes. I feel like the highs are higher, but the lows are lower.
The lonelier, that's for sure.
Yeah. You also, you don't have to like the same, like as an IC, you can sort of like rant to anyone, and it's like just it's not true anymore.
Yes.
So, yeah.
The more senior you are as a manager, you get more and more feedback about how you show up, which like sometimes feels like, what has this got to do with anything? How much I smile.
and how other people see you show up can be completely different than from inside, right? Like I've had moments where I thought I was because I was so angry that I was really being raging, you know, and I asked somebody, and they were like, oh no, you were just very strict, and you let it be known that you did not agree with that. And I'm like, what, really? It's just, or they think I'm authoritarian, and I'm like, that's the last thing I want to be. That to me is it's almost like a bad thing to tell me. So yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah, when it feels a little personal, that's when it's a bit heartbreaking. But you know what? Through all the missteps, like you said, there are successes. So let's switch on to the more positive side of things, because, you know, while you learn a lot from your missteps, you also learn from your successes, because it's this like loop, right? Like sometimes things are going great and sometimes they're not. And how you deal with it is how, you know, how you emerge from it is the mark of how you're going to end up. So over to you, Willie, and I want to hear from all of you, but starting with you, Willie, what was that project deliverable? What is that one thing that you achieved that made you finally feel like, I've got this, I'm actually good at this?
I realized after we last time we spoke, I've kind of had that every single step when I've grown, and there's these, these milestones that you have where suddenly, boom, you do something new. But one of the first ones where I was asked to help on a project that was behind in the time on the time deliverable. It had people that didn't report into me at all. And it was very high profile. So it was around a mobile app for our user conference. And that was not easy. And I had never had it where people don't report into me, yet I'm going to have to get like, come on, guys, let's go, or let's do this. And so in the beginning, I was like, and then I was just like, okay, I said yes to this. So I might as well just do my thing. And my thing is just get to know the people, talk to them, make sure that they have a voice, and get them to trust me. And those things kind of go hand in hand. You start small with like, hey, shall we do this? You promise something or you show something, you make it happen, and then you just repeat and repeat. And we did it. It ended up being super rewarding, because people that didn't report to me suddenly gave me feedback of like, oh, this was super cool, and that was great, and thank you for doing so and so. And they didn't have to, because it's not like I control their salaries, but so that was super meaningful to me. And we became a nice tight group, and we delivered what we had to deliver. It was hard. It was a bit of a death march, which I'm not a fan of, but we did it. And that was the first time once it was delivered and I was at the user conference, I was just like, yes, did it. Now I can take a break.
That's amazing. We're almost at time. Did Jenn or Kamilah, did you want to share a quick story?
I mean, I think at least as a manager, I think the first time where it felt like I got this was probably like going through my first performance review cycle, and then coming at the end feeling like, yeah, I was able to advocate for the folks on my team. Like this went well. So I think that was like my big, like, okay, I think I can do this. This is a thing. There were no surprises. I was able to argue for folks, and I felt really good about that.
Nice. How about you, Jenn?
Yeah, I'll say that I never really feel like I got this, but if I had to pick like one thing that I felt like that was a really useful learning that made me feel like more confident, if you will, is at some point in the past few years, I've had a huge past few years, I guess, I realized like as a manager or a person who leads a team and then an org and then multiple teams, no one is going to do the work if you don't do it. And I don't know, like as an IC, a lot of people do things for you and they put things in place and then you follow along. And even that's true for like entry level managers, and like as you're there's always someone above you who is setting the framework for you to insert yourself on. It gets a little bit more and more amorphous over time. But at some point I realized, these teams are not going to grow unless I advocate for them. No one's going to tell me like, oh, your teams look small, you should probably ask for more headcount. You like independently have to come up. And it's kind of, it's a level of creativity that I didn't think that you could exercise not being an IC anymore, because like engineering is like you're creating things and it's so fun. And as a manager, I just tell people what to do, beep, boop, beep, boop. But there's actually like an element to it that is really fun and creative once you kind of like, once you embrace all of the different pieces that you have to use to paint your picture, if you will.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Absolutely. But I'm with you. I'm like that too. Sometimes I'm like, have I really got this? And I, go down the spiral. But with that, I'm going to wrap. Thank you so much, ladies, for taking time out of your absolutely busy day to educate, inspire, and lead us through this. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yes.
And now I have 3 extra people in my network.
I know, winning.
Yeah.